Welcome back to Conversations, episode 6. We are officially more than a month into the show, so whether you're a first-time or long-time listener, we appreciate it either way. Thank you very much for being here and joining us. And if you are not already subscribed to the show, go ahead and do that. We're available on all of your favorite podcast platforms. And if you find one that you listen to that we are not on, let us know and we'll make sure to get on that one ASAP. We are on all socials that matter: Facebook, Twitter, X, at KBEX_ATC, Instagram at ConversationsPod, and of course, you can send us an email for the mailbag, or if you just want to connect with us that way, conversationspod@gmail.com. We have a lot to talk about today, a couple of, call it pseudo-sports topics, sports media, if you will. Then we'll go ahead and we'll talk about some news from college basketball, possibility of further NCAA Tournament expansion, and then we will dip into the mailbag again. Got a question from there that came in last week, so we'll make sure to take the questions that are coming from you guys, the listeners. So a lot to talk about. It was a huge weekend in sports last weekend. We're really not going to focus too much on the results of that, but it was a really good weekend. College football did not disappoint. The best games of the weekend that I had in the Around the Corn Sports blog preview from last week, all were within a touchdown. So it was a really good week for the best games, and we saw a number of upsets at the top 5 as well that had us talking about those on Sunday and Monday. Ryder Cup didn't really go the way that we had hoped, but it was at least entertaining on Sunday, so I will give the U.S. team that. They did not quit, but it would have been nice to start better. And then, of course, we've got MLB playoffs going on right now, and those have been exciting as well up to this point, and those will continue on here for the rest of the month. And it should be pretty exciting. There's a lot of good teams that are left. I think the storylines should be good. You've got big market, you've got mid-market, you've got best players really in the game. Pretty much everybody is in there. So it should be good moving forward on that end for baseball. But jumping right into it with the sports media topics, this one's pseudo-sports, I guess you could say, but it's interesting because it's kind of tied with a topic that we discussed last week, and we'll get into that a little bit here in a minute. But Paul Finebaum came out earlier this week and has announced that he is seriously considering running for public office in the state of Alabama. There is a Senate spot that is expected to be open. Tommy Tuberville, another former sports guy, former head coach in college football for a number of programs, including the Auburn Tigers, has announced his intention to run for governor. So there's going to be an open Senate seat in the state of Alabama. And how this ties into last week's topic is that Bruce Pearl's retirement was not necessarily expected the way that it happened. However, there have been rumors for some time that it was actually Bruce Pearl who was considering a run at public office and that he would be the one looking at that Senate seat that is likely going to be open. But that is not the case. Pearl is not running for office. However, a different sports guy in the state of Alabama, or who is known well in the state of Alabama by the constituency, is going to take a run at that spot. And I find it very interesting that the state of Alabama has a guy, a former head coach in college football, who's going to be running for governor. They've got a guy now who might be running for his empty Senate seat that is known best for his takes on SEC football. And it got me to thinking a little bit, and we're not a political podcast. We're not a gimmick podcast necessarily, but I thought it was fun looking at the current politicians in the state of Alabama and trying to gauge which ones might be able to make the crossover to the other side. So we've got some guys now that are looking to make the jump from sports to politics. How about the other way around? Sort of, any of these guys good candidates to make the jump from politics to sports? Or I guess, what would they be doing potentially if they were in the sports world? So this segment honestly would be a little bit better if this were a video podcast, because I would have a chance to flash up these guys' faces, and part of the conclusions that I've made about these guys are based on looks, quite honestly. But we'll go ahead and we'll try this anyway. If it's a terrible segment, let me know. If you found it funny, let me know that too. Hopefully it's the latter. But yeah, so 2 Senate spots in the Senate for Alabama. Obviously, Tommy Tuberville is one of them. We know his background as far as sports is concerned. But the other current Senate holder, Katie Britt, also actually has a sports connection. She is a sports wag, wife and girlfriend, for those of you not in the know. She is Wesley Britt's Wesley Britt's wife. Wesley Britt was a former NFL player at University of Alabama. That's actually where they met. And she herself was a cheerleader in high school, and if you took a look at her, you'd probably be able to guess that. So I don't really think that there's much of a jump here. She's a wag, so that's how she would fit into the sports world. And I suppose if you wanted to say, potential gymnastics coach, that might be a fit for Miss Britt. But yeah, moving to the House, there's 6 that I have written down here, and some of them were a little bit easier to come up with potential landing spots in the sports world for them. And I'll actually start with the one that was the easiest, because he did play at the University of Alabama, and that's Gary Palmer. He was a walk-on wide receiver under Bear Bryant when the Bear was still at Alabama, and so I thought that the landing spot, or a good fit for Palmer, would be perhaps a guy who took on a head coaching job at the major FBS level. Maybe a guy who is known for running his program on the values of family, possibly even religion. Maybe he wouldn't be totally into NIL. And maybe this is a guy who would tell you that you better buy his stock in him as a coach. I don't know. Who knows? Gary Palmer, that's my take on him. I think there's a lot of similarities there. If you get my joke about who I may be referencing. But yeah, moving on, another guy who actually I think might fit in sports, Dale Strong. And Dale was an EMS and a volunteer firefighter before his politician days. And so I could definitely see him being an offensive line or a defensive line coach. He's got that look. But, he also looks like somebody else who is known for being in the bracket bunker in the months of February and March. And so maybe you could have Dale brackets going on if he had decided to go into sports instead of politics. But moving right along here, there's a few guys that I really had a hard time kind of figuring out whether or not they would be able to fit into sports. They're kind of your run-of-the-mill looking politicians, if you will. That's Barry Moore, Mike Rogers, and Robert Aderholt. And for Mike Rogers and Robert Aderholt, I figured they probably could swap with each other. They look like potentially either the SEC commissioner or a member of the College Football Playoff Committee. You just go and look at them and tell me that that's not a guy that could be placed onto the CFP committee. Either one of those guys. And for Barry, he might have been a proper candidate for the Auburn head coaching job for basketball. And I'm not going to go into too many details about his political past, but there were some run-ins with the law that Mr. Moore has had in his career, and to some extent, those run-ins parallel another Auburn basketball coach, or I guess former basketball coach, in terms of how he handled being under oath. So I'll leave it at that for Barry Moore. But the last one, Terry Sewell, she wanted to be a Broadway star as a kid and was on the debate team. And so for Terry, I think she could actually take over Paul Finebaum's spot if he decides he wants to run for Senate and she's looking for a different change of pace in career. Terry would be a great fit for Finebaum's show, debating with the callers, or maybe even a regular guest on the now defunct Around the Horn show that used to be on ESPN. I think anybody who is into the debate nature is a good candidate for that show. But Terry was a friend of Michelle Obama at Princeton, actually considered her a big sister during her time there at Princeton, and that's how she was convinced that a career in politics was for her. So she was able to rub elbows with the Obamas and get herself into the House within Alabama. So that's what I've got there. Little fun segment again. Probably better if you can flash up the screen, but go ahead and take a look at those guys. Go wiki at them and tell me if you agree with my assessment of where they might have ended up had they decided a career in sports was for them. But moving right along to the other sports media topic, if you will, this week. This one was very interesting to me because it's just yet another instance of ESPN kind of shooting themselves in the foot. And this one really isn't ESPN's fault, if you will, but somebody that they employ maybe put their foot in their mouth on the broadcast that they were on, and now they're backtracking a little bit. So Ben McDonald, who is a commentator for baseball at ESPN, was on the call of one of the wildcard playoff games earlier this week, the Cubs and Padres. And during the during the broadcast, they were doing a segment promoting the kickoff of the NHL season on ESPN, of course, that ESPN has paid some money for and has some obligations to sponsors to promote that product. And when asked whether or not he would be tuning in, Ben took a pretty hardline stance on that and basically said that no, there was no way he would be watching the NHL, and that he would not even be really paying attention to what's going on there. And obviously, there was some backlash that occurred as a result of that. A lot of fans of the NHL coming to the defense of the sport, maybe even taking some shots at baseball as a result of what McDonald had said. And perhaps the most interesting shot that was taken at McDonald was from a fellow ESPN colleague. John Buccigross came out and kind of took a shot at McDonald in his playing career as a baseball player, which seemingly was a little unnecessary, a little bit of fuel to the fire that didn't need to be done. But what this really goes to show is that the team at ESPN is struggling at this point to keep themselves out of the news for these types of things. It's kind of unfortunate the way that it's gone in terms of the personalities over there. Money has had a lot to do with it. They seemingly don't want to pay their best on-air talent. Not to say that McDonald isn't a good on-air talent, but this is a no-brainer. This is a 101. You play the game. You are employed by ESPN. ESPN broadcasts the NHL. They've paid a lot of money to make sure that they have that. It's one of the diversification efforts that they've done to get people to actually associate ESPN with live sports and not just, back and forth banter throughout the day. And to not play that game and to basically say, yeah, no, that's not for me, I'm not going to watch that, I don't care, is just a really bad look. Really bad look. And I'm surprised that there hasn't been more stringent action taken against him, quite frankly. McDonald has come back and essentially said, oh, it was a joke, or, hey, I'm just being honest. I've got other obligations. There's going to be MLB baseball on at the same time. But again, it's one of those things that anybody who has worked at a corporate setting before knows is you've got to play the game. And it doesn't seem like McDonald wants to play the game. So we'll see what happens moving forward with that. But just found it interesting. It seems like we're constantly hearing some issues that ESPN is having with their on-air talent, and it's not the type of news that you want to bring attention to as a network that is really kind of struggling, I would say, at this point, for relevance when it comes to being known for live sports and not for the comments that are made by the talent. But moving on from that, a big, I guess, about face that was done from the NCAA about the possibility of the NCAA tournament expanding. So this one was interesting because not that long ago, just a couple of months ago, the NCAA had mentioned that there would not be any further expansion of the NCAA tournament. We would be at 68 teams. It was kind of a welcome communication from the general fan base because 68 seems like a good number. 64, frankly, seemed like a good number. And we can all handle the first four. It's a nice little palate wetting, if you will, the first couple of days of the tournament, and it really doesn't take away from the big days, the Thursday through Sunday of the first and second rounds, and it also doesn't dilute what has become a hot topic throughout the last several weeks of the regular season, which is the bubble. At the end of the day, you look at the teams that are being left out or being included into the field of 68, and you've got a lot of teams that are kind of middle of the road, whether it be mid-major teams that had a good season, but they are mid-major teams, or you have the major conference teams that maybe had a little bit of a rough stretch during the regular season, and in a lot of cases, they're right around 500 in conference, and those are the types of teams that are right there, maybe making it, maybe not, on a year-in, year-out basis. But this week, it was announced that they are now seriously considering the possibility of expanding the tournament from 68 to 76 teams. And with that would come 12 games as part of that. Currently, it's called the first four. They've mentioned that it would likely be called the opening round. And it has been met with a lot of negative feedback from the fan base, and I think it's warranted. It's a bad idea, in my opinion. They had mentioned that this is not for the money, that it would not be a massive money maker for the tournament, and that's coach speak to me. This is always done because of money. At the very least, it's done because of the potential advertising dollars. But when you consider that the first four, to some extent, is still kind of a niche offering, it's not something that everybody is going to be watching. It's kind of for the sickos, if you will. 2 games on Tuesday night, 2 games on Wednesday night, all at the same arena. They're typically ending right around midnight Eastern time, so it's something that you've got to stay up for. And they're going to try to add to that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And if you're saying that it doesn't make sense because it's not a moneymaker, well, then why are you doing it? To include what teams that have been left out historically that have a huge argument for being included into a tournament that is ultimately supposed to crown a champion. At the end of the day, you're looking at teams that have a 500 or worse record in conference, that they're not the definition of champion at all. The truth of the matter is we've seen it once, that a team that came from the first 4, which would have been one of the last teams to make the tournament, has actually made a run at winning the national title. And now we're going to add 8 more of those teams. What this is going to look like as far as an opening round is concerned is that they'll have all of the 10 to 12 seeds be decided by an opening round game. Somewhere within that 10 to 12 range, they'll have a play-in game for each one of those, and then you'll have a play-in game for all 4 of the 16 seeds. And it's something that just seems to me like a total money grab. It seems to me like something that's going to further dilute a bubble that over the past several years has really not looked particularly strong to begin with. And it just doesn't need to be done. This is a sports format that is as close to perfect as they could get. That there doesn't need to be change. Sometimes when things are not broken, you don't have to fix them. So hopefully this is something that the amount of negative feedback will make them think twice, although we should know better that when they are leaking information like this, it's probably going to happen. So we'll circle back to this if they do indeed decide to expand the tournament, and we'll maybe get a little bit deeper into what that actually means. But for now, just the fact that it came up and it is something that they're considering a possibility is a little bit disappointing. Agreement has yet to be finalized, but it's probably going that direction. So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll dive into the mailbag. So we've got one question, came to me about a week ago. So I apologize that we haven't gotten to answer this now, but I think it still holds relevance. So without any further rambling here, this one comes from Trent. He says, "Hello, K-Bex. We saw a massive upset with Virginia beating Florida State last Friday night, and the fans stormed the field in celebration. I myself have stormed the field before, and I will always remember that night. However, many pointed out that the wide receiver for Florida State could have been in harm's way with that large of a crowd ready to stampede over him to celebrate. We have also seen other figures in college basketball call out court storming and say, while it's part of the fan culture, it's also unsafe and sometimes disruptive if there is still a couple of seconds left in the game. There have even been reported deaths at concerts due to crowd storming a venue to get the best spots possible before the show. My question is, field court storming is looked at as a cultural norm after a big upset. However, should anything change to balance out the inherent risk?" Well, thanks for the question, Trent. I think that this is an interesting question to ask because that field storming last Friday in Charlottesville was one of the more raucous crowds, I guess you could say, after a victory that I've seen on a football field in some time. It actually reminisced of some of the court stormings that you see in college basketball. So to tie that in with your question, yes, it did kind of look like one of the court stormings. And the court stormings to me are the ones that hold the the greatest level of inherent risk, only because you're talking about a smaller venue, you're talking about a hardwood floor as opposed to grass, you're talking about kids trying to jump over sometimes barriers that don't exist at the football games. So from my perspective, definitely there's more risk with the court storming than there is with the field rushing. However, in this case, you could make the argument that there was maybe not enough time that had elapsed after the play was finished before the kids went onto the field and celebrated. But to do something to change it, I think that's what your question really was. To me, it really comes down to the level of security that is in place to handle such activities. I've watched the video of the field rushing at Virginia several times now. I've seen it from multiple angles, and from what I've seen, there's only about 2 security guards trying to manage that entire corner of the field where most of the students are. And my argument is that if there's a possibility for a court storming or a field rushing, which there's going to be at collegiate events, then you need to have the security in place to make sure that you're doing everything possible to avoid injuries. Let's create a thought experiment here. What if they had a line of security guards in front of the student section that were going to be there to essentially create a barrier from that happening like it did? Would that solve the problem? I would argue it probably would, because there's strength in numbers, and when you have a whole line of security guards that are maybe even able to lock arms in some cases, just to give the impression that there is some level of security that's going on there, it can change the reaction that you're going to get from the crowd about how they're going to handle such an activity. And they didn't do that, at least from what I saw. Now, if somebody can correct me and point out that there were many more security guards than that and they were just overtaken so quickly, fine. Then maybe we're having a different discussion. But to me, this was a problem in terms of the University of Virginia and the number of security personnel that they had on the field to make sure that something like what happened didn't happen the way that it happened. For me, I have no problem with field rushing. I think it's part of the tradition, as you mentioned, and I think it's something that needs to stay in the game, especially in areas like Charlottesville, where you've got a program that doesn't really get to experience that very often. That's something, to your point, Trent, you remember it from your days of being able to enjoy that. That's going to be something that they're going to remember too, and maybe it'll prompt them to come back to more games. Virginia football is not known exactly as a hotbed in the sport. So that's my take on it. It's a great question. I think that safety obviously has to be treated as the number one priority, but at the same time, you've got to make sure that you can handle it from a personnel perspective, and I think that's maybe where the program didn't quite meet expectations in this case. So yeah, for the rest of you listening, if you have a question like Trent, we're happy to take it as long as it's about sports. We'll cover it, and that's really what makes this show go at this point. Conversations is a conversation. It's not a monologue. At least it's not supposed to be. So if you're interested in sending a question, again, we can be reached at conversationspod@gmail.com. That's the easiest way to get your mailbag question read. But if you want to send it another way, comments within one of the podcast platforms or on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, that's all right as well. We'll take them any way they come, and that is something that we want to continue to develop here as this podcast moves forward. Another great weekend in sports coming up. Hopefully everybody enjoys it. Hopefully this wasn't a podcast that made you jump ship. Again, we're not a gimmick podcast necessarily, but we do like to have fun here, and hopefully you do too. So thanks for listening, and until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.